Hello and welcome to the 42nd episode of the Hope Illuminated podcast, your source for stories, science, and strategy where we live, learn, and work. This is a resilience and mental health promotion and suicide prevention conversation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, and I'm on a life mission to help empower communities with solutions that help people overcome isolation and despair and rekindle a passion for living. Each episode, we're joined by international experts who inspire hope and offer real guidance. Welcome to the show. I'm so grateful you've joined us. Today, we have a dear friend and an amazing expert in many things. I am going to ask him to specifically talk about one thing today, although we could talk all day about all the things that are in his brain. Dr. Bart Andrews is calling in today from St. Louis, and our conversation today is going to be about how to cut through the clutter of all the noise that we have around all the communication that comes at us every day. And especially how to get a message of suicide prevention or mental health promotion out in a very effective way to the people that you're trying to reach. Now, this is a really important conversation for us to have all the time, but it's specifically important when there's a lot of noise, a lot of competing for your attention around messages around suicide prevention or mental health promotion that sometimes happens every September when we have World Suicide Prevention Day or National Suicide Prevention Week. So we're going to talk about how to not have your audience tune out or numb out from the things that you're talking about. And we can learn a lot from what businesses and marketing communities have been figuring out for quite some time as the space in messaging gets more and more crowded. So just some 5 tips to think about out of the gate. One is that when you're asking yourself with these messaging strategies, does your message actually add value to your listener? Does your message improve the lives of people who receive it? Is it helpful? At least is it somewhat engaging and entertaining? Is there a call to action that's clear to the person receiving it? Which brings me to the second point. Is it clear? Can you just get to the point? Can you be direct? People don't have time. They don't have time for long emails. They don't have time for long articles a lot of times. So is your language jargon-free? And how is it competing with other maybe opposing messages, and how do you differentiate your message? One of the things that's come up for me in thinking about this is the phrase that we often use in the suicide prevention field, the phrase suicide ideation. I know when I say that sometimes to the general public, it sounds very jargony, it sounds very clinical, and people are like, what do you mean, like suicidal thoughts? And I'm like, yeah, kind of like suicidal thoughts. And they're like, well, why don't you just say suicidal thoughts? Why do you got to be all fancy pants with your jargon? And that's led us to think about maybe some better descriptors like the phrase suicide intensity, which sometimes can be a better way to describe not only thoughts, but kind of feelings and experiences in the body, as well as the dynamic movement that people often experience of more intense suicidal intensity and less intense and so forth. So things like that I think can help get some clarity. Number 3, so number 1, does it add value? Number 2, is it clear? Number 3, is it concise? One of the things I think that really helps us in this space is using infographics. We can take in a whole lot more information visually, quickly, than we can reading paragraphs and paragraphs. So that's part of the reason why infographics have become so popular, is that we can communicate very, very quickly. Number 4, is your message compelling? There's so many things kind of jamming into us. Like every day I'm so annoyed by the CNN breaking news things that come every 5 minutes, or, Facebook pushing me cat videos, and they work because they get you distracted, they get your attention. So is your message communicating some kind of mechanism of engagement? Is there a mechanism of urgency? Or as we'll talk about in our conversation today, is there elements of humor that people can resonate with? Or is there a story that people are connecting with? Some point of your message has got to be rising above in the hierarchy of interest in your awareness field. And so thinking about how to make your message compelling. And number 5, is it credible? Are you a trustworthy source? And if people don't know you, or you don't have that around you, can you document where you got your information from so that it seems credible? So where do we get our information about suicide prevention and mental health promotion? And What are some reliable data sources like the Suicide Prevention Resource Center or the American Association of Suicidology or the National Institutes of Mental Health and so on, so that when people get the data, they're like, okay, this seems pretty credible. And then we're also going to talk a little bit today about this really important topic in suicide prevention, specifically around safe messaging. And right now in our little world, we're having lots of conversations about that. What do we know about our safe messaging guidelines? What are the best practices? What are we just assuming is a best practice, and so forth? So that's a little bit about where we're headed today with Bart. Bart and I go back a little bit. Currently, we are serving together on the American Association of Suicidology's board of directors. So through that shared service, I've gotten to know him and many, many talents that he's bringing to the table. He is such a doer, let me just say. He's on like 8 committees, always working so hard to improve our field in so many ways. And so, Bart, I just want to say to the public how grateful I am for your service in the multiple ways that you contribute to AAS, American Association of Suicidology. He's also a leader within BHR Worldwide, which provides all kinds of services to his local and statewide community. For crisis support, and he has served in leadership positions in crisis services in many places and spaces. I think I probably first got to know you with your leadership roles and your founding roles with the Suicide Prevention Social Media, SPSM, Twitter chats, following you there, just being absolutely floored by your wit, how fast your brain moves and how fast your fingers move. Sometimes, at least once that I can think of, Bart and I were Twitter ambassadors together for the National Council for Behavioral Health. And he would send out like 8 tweets from every one, and not just any tweet. They would have beautiful graphics and all kinds of links. I was like, how do you move so fast? So if you're ever on a Twitter chat with Bart, you'll know what I mean, because the content that comes out is fast and furious and really awesome. And then I think I can speak for many of us in the field who follow you on Facebook and in other places, that we're just so grateful for the comic relief that you bring to us every day. Bart sends out memes that just, I think, get your fancy, and believe me, we're all grateful for the laughs that you bring us through that. So thanks, Bart, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Sally. That was a most generous introduction. I for a while didn't realize you were talking about me, and then I was a little mortified and embarrassed because I don't see myself that way. But thank you. I think one of the things for many of us in suicide prevention, it doesn't ever feel like we can do enough. And there is so much to do, and the problem keeps getting worse, that at times it feels insurmountable, but we keep plugging away. And you're one of those folks that has really been carrying the torch for a really long time. And I appreciate you having me on to talk about this. This is, you have heard me say this. I absolutely am against safe messaging. I think the term safe messaging is completely the wrong term. I think safetyism is a huge problem in our culture, and since I am in the mental health field and in academic circles, and there's people that kind of lean to the left, safetyism is something that is accepted as gospel, and I think actually safetyism is contributing to our suicide crisis in a really big way, and nobody wants to talk about it.
So I'm going to back you up just a second, because I think this is going to be the heart of our conversation today, but I want to actually start with your story, because I think I don't remember when you came out, but as a suicide attempt survivor, but I remember the moment that the field felt it, and how many years ago that was. But because you were, well established as a leader in the field, and you came out in a very public way at a conference, is that right? Or at least to the general public. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your story?
Yeah. So, I mean, just the coming out itself was an incredibly difficult process. So one of the things that's really hard, because my suicide experience, my attempt was in 1998. So we're talking 21 years ago. One of the things that's really hard to explain to people is that I didn't even see myself as a suicide attempt survivor, and probably till 2011, 2012. It was this thing that happened that I got away from as quickly as I possibly could and buried. And the first time that I even acknowledged to myself that I was a suicide attempt survivor out loud was in a hotel room in Little Rock. The National Association of Crisis Organization Directors was meeting, and the president at the time, just a wonderful woman and mentor, at a meeting talked about, well, I've been struggling with suicide thoughts my entire life. And it was the first time in a professional setting I heard another professional talk about suicide, about them having a suicide experience. And there, just for a moment, I was like, oh my God, she's like me. I've been there. And that was the first time, that was the first crack where this, and given that I was in the crisis community since '98, dealing and working in crisis intervention, suicide prevention, but not being really connected with this part of myself, that was the first crack. The second crack in that shell came when I saw Kevin Hines speak at National, it was the National Council for Behavioral Health Conference in Las Vegas, and I want to say 2013. And I saw Kevin Hines speak right before I was about to present. And so for those of you, if you haven't seen Kevin before, don't go and see Kevin before you're about to present, because that room was filled. That room, it was a big room. It wasn't the big stage, but it had to be seating 1,000 people, certainly 500. Tears. Cheryl Sharp was there. The Grahams are there. While Kevin was speaking, people were just bawling. Tears were pouring down my face. And seeing Kevin, this bright, passionate, articulate man, openly disclose his own struggle with suicide, I was like, me too. This has happened to me, and I've never been able to talk about it, right? And seeing Kevin fearlessly in front of all these strangers tell his story, another thing shook loose. And then the final step, and I think you might have been involved in this. I know Quicks, DeQuincy Lazine, the Way Forward document that the National Action Alliance put out. I was at a meeting in D.C. and Dr. Lazine, Quicks as we like to refer to him, mentioned that was talking about the Way Forward and talking about his own story. And I was like, okay, I've got a story. I need to tell the story. And what's really interesting is this process has been going on for years, but that was 2016. 2014. God, everything's been, that was 2014.
Yeah, 2014 was the year that the American Association of Suicidology, I feel like, turned a corner. The Way Forward came out from the National Action Alliance. And then that year, that conference was in LA, and it was just keynote after breakout session after panel of voices of lived experience. I call it the honeymoon year. It's the year we went, oh my gosh, this is so important. How did we miss this for so long?
And that's the year, isn't that the year that the lived experience division was started at AS, right? So this is all in the water. So there's clearly this energy in the water. And as part of the Way Forward, I was like, I need to tell my story. And the compulsion was inescapable. It's really hard to explain looking back now, but here I had been working and doing suicide prevention at that point for 16 years, nonstop. And I had this incredible need to get this story out. I was also petrified to tell my story. And I decided, I did a presentation in Kansas City for a regional conference on the Way Forward. I'm going to talk about the Way Forward. And so I was like, well, this is a good time to tell my story. So I was also worried because over the summer, there had been several instances of people in my network that had disclosed at work and then had negative consequences. Mm-hmm. Things did not go well, and their lived experience was used against them in a professional setting. And so I was a little nervous. I wasn't as nervous about what was going to happen to me. I kind of made a decision that if things were going to happen to me because of my disclosure, then I was going to deal with that. But I didn't want anything negative to impact my company, BHR. I've been at BHR since 1998. We're a groovy little crisis center in St. Louis, Missouri. Every day we are involved in suicide prevention and crisis intervention at state, national, and international level. And I didn't want to harm BHR. So my boss, the CEO here at BHR, Pat Coleman, who is amazing, I talked to Pat, and I told Pat, I said, I need to tell you something. So let me tell you something about me, Pat. And I told Pat, I gave Pat a very, very brief Cliff Note version of my story. And I said, I need to tell my story, but I am not going to tell this story. I was a vice president of operations at that time. And I said, if you think this is going to impact BHR, if you think this will negatively impact our reputation, if this will be a problem for us and make us less effective, I will not do it. And I was dead serious because I am incredibly vested in this company's success. And my boss is important to me, and I wanted her input. And Pat said to me without even hesitating, she said, you can't hurt BHR by telling your story. You can only make us stronger. You need to tell your story. Yeah, it was pretty, I look back on that conversation could have gone a completely different way. Pat didn't even blink. You can't hurt BHR. You can only make us stronger. Tell your story. Now, so I'm at this presentation in Kansas City, and I'm presenting on the way forward. Pat's sitting in the front row. And I did my whole presentation. I'm not kidding. My whole presentation. And at the very end of the presentation, this is how I did it, Sally, and I'm not exaggerating at all. I was like, in the spirit of the way forward, I'm also going to disclose to the group, I am a suicide attempt survivor. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening, and I'm out of here.
Tip your waiters.
That was it. By the way, for those listening, this is not the way to do it. But something interesting happened. I did that. It literally was 30 seconds. 30 seconds. And by the way, I'm a suicide attempt survivor. Hey, everybody, have a good night. I'm not here the rest of the week, whatever the case may be. After I did that, the number of providers that came up to me and in private said, me too, was eye-opening. That's when I really started to get a clue that, boy, I'm not alone. There's a lot of us, and there's a whole bunch of us, but people aren't talking about it. Now, the big disclosure came at the National Association of Crisis Organization Directors conference where I did the closing, and I did this 2-hour version of my story, which in hindsight I regret tremendously because it was incredibly detailed, and I probably disclosed way more than I should have. But what the heck? It was fun. But that was when really the lid blew off of it. And after that, for me, at first I felt the need to tell everybody, like, hey, by the way, I'm a suicide attempt survivor. Now, what's really interesting is I did some A/B testing on this, and what I found that was really interesting is that when I was in fancy, as people like to say, at the fancy meetings with the fancy people, and if you didn't know this, everybody, I'm going to spill the beans. There's a tremendous amount of meetings on suicide prevention, y'all, where literally nothing happens. If you didn't know this, and people are going to I don't care anymore, I'm done. There's a lot of meetings where people meet and talk, and then literally nothing occurs because that meeting happened. And there's a lot of meetings like that, and I've been to an awful lot of meetings like that. I was in a meeting like that, where clearly nothing was going to happen. I introduced myself as a suicide attempt survivor first, not as a psychologist or a suicide prevention expert or a crisis expert or an expert in all the crap that people claim I'm an expert in and that I sometimes agree with and sometimes don't. And something really interesting happened. I noticed that people wouldn't pay attention to me. And I would say something and nobody would respond. But if somebody else later said the exact same thing, people were like, oh, that's a great idea. So several things happened. One, I now notice that this happens to women at meetings, where a woman at a meeting will say something and nobody will say anything. And then a dude says it, everyone's like, Bob, that's a great idea. And I was like, this is what it feels like to experience bias and be marginalized. The other thing that I noticed is that if I didn't do that, and I just introduced myself as Bart, psychologist, VP at XYZ, when I said things, people really paid attention. And so it really dawned on me that people, were incredibly uncomfortable having suicide attempt survivors at the table. And that once they saw me as a suicide attempt survivor, it was really hard for them to see anything else. I think that's changing. I think, that was pretty early, late 2014 or 2015. I don't notice that as much now. I think we've made a lot of progress in 4 or 5 years, but it also struck me about the power differential and about how weak and really oppressed the voice of lived experience had been. I think things have changed. And I think sometimes for the better. I also will be quite vocal. I'm saying this for the record, just because you have lived experience doesn't mean you have lived expertise. And just because you have experience with mental illness or substance use or suicide doesn't mean that you know how to help people better or that everything you have to say is gold and we should just run with it. Because I've heard some pretty wacky things from people with lived experience that think because they think this would be helpful doesn't mean that we don't need to research and actually ask some questions about that to see if that would be helpful. And so I will be pretty clear. I'm more than willing to call out anybody at any given time about what I think is ridiculous. But I do think that we're moving more towards incorporating lived expertise and feedback from people with lived experience. I also think when I first disclosed, there's still these tiers of hierarchy inside lived experience. And for a while, people who only had thoughts of suicide weren't considered to have lived experience, which is just nonsense, right?
Or
so
even a near miss. Like, I held the gun, I put it down. You're not a suicide attempt. I'm like, what?
So there's this really interesting thing, and I think you probably saw Jeff Stolman talk about good survivors and bad survivors. I have a lot to say about that. I think there's a real tendency, particularly, and I'm gonna call out our younger folks, although older folks do this. We really started creating this us-them thinking, and a lot of the things that we're teaching the younger generation are these really bad cognitive distortions. Things are good or bad. People are good or bad. You're in this category or in that category. Also, that words are violence. If you're in the words or violence crowd, please stop, because as a victim of violence, I can tell you words are not violence. If you don't like that, I'm sorry. Words are not violence. And us and them never helps anybody ever. But there are elements and there are certainly dimensions to what Jess was talking about that I think are really important. And part of that is that, for instance, certain survivors, I've actually heard survivors calling out other survivors who shared their means of how they tried to kill themselves as being dangerous. That's utterly ludicrous. There's absolutely no evidence that someone with lived experience of a suicide attempt, in telling their story that discloses their attempt, is somehow dangerous to their audience. That is simply untrue. And in fact, the evidence, and you probably saw there was a recent randomized controlled trial, another one, we now have 2, that shows that completely violating safe messaging guidelines has no impact on people's suicidality when we do randomized controlled studies. Which is, you would think that the safe messaging folks who have been touting how dangerous messaging is, but we have no randomly controlled studies. The 2 randomly controlled studies that we have at this point say, no, that's not in fact the case. You think they'd say, oh, maybe we should take a step back because the randomly controlled trials aren't showing what these observational studies are, which gets me to one of my big issues. I have a huge problem when we take observational population level relationship data and say that it's causal. It's a huge problem. And my little rant here is that what we lack is specificity. So there's ample data that shows that there's relationships between types of media and media saturation and population suicide rates. Not going to dispute this, don't need to dispute it. I think it's pretty clear that there's certainly at times a relationship between suicide in the media and population suicide rates. I don't think we understand at all what that actually means. I'll give you a great example. Kurt Cobain, the coverage of Kurt Cobain's suicide was anything but safe. It was saturated. It lasted for months and months and months. We didn't see an increase. Well, if it's causal, why did it happen with Kurt Cobain? Well, it didn't happen with Kurt Cobain. So then you've really got to ask yourself too, this gets really interesting. People talk about causation, and when you talk about causation with these statistical models, it's not the same thing. If someone gets cancer from smoking, I can actually prove this person got this type of cancer from smoking because people who don't smoke don't get this type of cancer. I can actually show specificity. This person smoked, they got this kind of cancer. You don't get this kind of cancer if you don't smoke. There's not one single suicide death that an expert can go and say, 13 reasons why caused this person's death. You simply cannot do it. There's absolutely no way to prove any individual's death. And I promise you, if there was a way to do this, there would be lawsuits flying off the shelves. And in fact, people have tried to sue media providers for people's suicide deaths. And what's abundantly clear is that the level of evidence that we have will not work in a court of law to suggest that a social media message, a movie, a song, a video caused someone's suicide death. So for me, this is really vital. If you can't show causality at a specific level to a person, this message killed this person, then you need to drop your causal modeling because it doesn't work. So then we got to ask ourselves, what does this mean? It means that we understand there's a relationship between these two things. We definitely don't know enough to know this causes that. And there's a downside to safe messaging that nobody wants to talk about. It makes people reluctant to talk about suicide in a free and open manner because they're afraid it's going to create contagion. Well, let's talk about contagion. Contagion may be 1 to 5%, maybe, of youth suicides. 2, youth suicides are a small percentage of overall suicides. If you eliminated all contagion deaths completely, you probably wouldn't even see a blip on the suicide rate. The suicide rate probably wouldn't even drop in a meaningful way. Yet we spend an inordinate amount of attention on safe messaging when in fact that is not in any way going to meaningfully impact our annual suicide rate, in my humble opinion. Maybe some study and further research, I'm always open, maybe something's going to break loose where it's like, oh, this really does. But 2, it's not an evidence-based practice. We tout safe messaging like it's an evidence-based practice. If you do this, you get these results. We have zero evidence. There's one study in Europe, it might be a Belgium train study, where they changed the messaging in a train station and suicide rate dropped after that messaging. So we got one study that showed that it hasn't been replicated, and certainly hasn't been replicated at a national level. There was a study in California where they spent millions of dollars trying to get media to change their messaging, and they spent all this money and time, didn't even have an impact on the messaging or the suicide rate.
Interesting.
So one of the things that I like to talk about, and this is to Dr. April Foreman, one of the co-creators of SPSM Chat and a huge influence on me, she really, this idea of we don't need to focus on safe messaging. We need to focus on effective messaging. Mm-hmm. What works, right? So safe messaging, in my honest opinion, has become a part of a cultural call-out phenomenon. People see unsafe messaging and they feel this is one thing they can do. They can call out 13 Reasons Why. They can call out this movie or this song, and they feel empowered by doing that, right? Oh, I can make a difference, but you're not. You absolutely, and in fact, all that attention for 13 Reasons Why, a couple of things about that. One, all it did was drive up 13 Reasons Why ratings. It didn't impact Netflix bottom line in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the bigwigs at Netflix were thrilled with the negative attention that it got, because all it did was drive up the ratings. 2, if you look at the evidence, there's some evidence, in fact, that how we model behavior does influence behavior. And if we're telling a bunch of youth watching 13 Reasons Why is dangerous and may cause you to kill yourself, what if that, in fact, increases the likelihood people are going to engage in suicide attempt behavior? Mm-hmm. What if we're normalizing this response that by trying to prevent it? What if we're increasing it? I don't know if that's true or not, but boy, the research says that teens who have a higher expectation and have a more normalized view of suicide behavior are more likely to engage in suicide behavior. And we're normalizing suicide behavior that if you watch Netflix, you're more likely to engage in suicide behavior. What if that increases suicide behavior?
Right. I know.
It's certainly possible. So
let's pivot. Let's pivot because I want to make sure we get to what April was talking about. Let's focus on effective messaging, because I also think that you have spent some time thinking about, how do we message about this effectively, and how do we, again, cut through the clutter so that people are actually paying attention to the things that we want them to be listening to and changing their behavior in the way that we want them to.
So I think this is really important, because I think to be effective, we need to do a couple of things. One, I think we need to really put our emphasis on this concept that suicidal thoughts are treatable. I think way too much, and I'm stealing this from Dr. David Jobs, who really, I mean, we've been nibbling around the edges of this, and I've been nibbling around the edge of this, but Dr. Jobs has really hit home this idea that our focus has been on preventing attempts, and that's great, and preventing deaths, which also is great. Those are all good things, but we really need to be focused on reducing suicide thoughts and create this concept that suicide thoughts are treatable, right? Suicide thoughts aren't even that rare. Suicide behavior is relatively rare. I also, and I will tell you this, I get really concerned because in certain circles of lived experience movement, being in any way saying suicide behavior is bad, people get worked up. You shouldn't judge people. No, you shouldn't judge people, but I'm going to stand here and I'm going to tell you, yeah, I don't want anybody engaging in suicide behavior. I want to stop it. I think suicide behavior is bad. There, I just said it. I'm a suicide attempt survivor. I would gladly not have made that attempt. Gladly. Don't have any qualms about it. Would have preferred that I not gone through that. So this idea that we need to be so accepting, we need to be accepting of people. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you're thinking about suicide, I absolutely do not want you to try suicide behavior. I don't think it's okay. I don't want you to do it. Suicide thoughts are pretty normal and not uncommon at all. And we need to be incredibly active in saying, let's stop it there. Let's focus on the suicide thoughts and let's lean into that and let's treat suicide thoughts. So I think that's one of the things that we need to really focus on. Suicide thoughts are not unusual. And there are many, many, many treatments that are really effective too. There are people who live their entire lives with suicide thoughts and live productive lives. So there are ways to provide support and care for people where they never end up getting to suicide behavior. So I think that we really need to hone in on suicide thoughts are treatable. That's one. But yeah,
I had a question about that because I'm also hearing some pushback a little bit on kind of the predominant paradigm that we have about this, which is the medical model, and the term treatable kind of speaks to that you got to go to a doctor and get treated. I mean, I think that is one pathway through suicidal thoughts. Then there are others. I think, that maybe the message is that suicidal thoughts are changeable, or suicidal thoughts are, I don't know what the word is, but to kind of encompass other pathways through that maybe aren't so much of a medical model.
That makes me completely insane. So no, I disagree with that 100%. So here's what has happened, right? So people are upset about the medical model. So anything that smacks of the medical model, and now we got to change our language. Oh, you can't talk about the medical model treatment. So if you cut yourself and you go to Walgreens and get you get antibiotic ointment and alcohol, and you put a Band-Aid on it, that's treatment. But did you go to the doctor to do that? Are you still treating your wound?
Works for me. Thank you. All right.
So
no, that's it. That's all I want to hear.
Yeah. So I think that there's so much packed into this too. There are many aspects of things that happen inside of the healthcare system that I think are truly problematic. They are. But our goal should not be to reject that. It should be to improve it, not get rid of it. Mm-hmm. So if you could go to the hospital and get evidence-based care that was caring, compassionate, and didn't instantly just throw you into a room and keep you for a few days and then discharge you, but actually gave you care that helped you feel better, why wouldn't you go to the hospital, or why wouldn't you go to your doctor? So I think that when I look at the pushback against the medical model and we shouldn't talk about treatment and we need to be holistic, it's incredibly wrong-headed. Wrong-headed in terms of, let's leverage the resources and the infrastructure we currently have and make it better, and then we can certainly add to it. I'm all about all kinds of avenues for people getting care and support. Should family members be trained in how to help a loved one? Absolutely. But CPR is part of the medical model. It's not like some people up the street that had heart attacks were like, oh, we're going to develop our own thing and we're going to call it CPR. No, right. It actually came out of research.
And the whole caregiving movement, right, is empowering family members to give medical care to one another. So I love it. So 2 points came out of that. One, let's focus on the upstream. Let's focus on the thoughts, not just the attempts. And let's have messages that, yes, this is treatable, whether you self-treat it, families helping treat it, you go to a professional caregiver to get treatment. They can be changed through treatment. All right, you had a second thought.
You got it. second message, okay, everybody who's constantly online or on any listservs or complaining about safe messaging, stop it. If you want a campaign to get onto, find out why your local hospitals, local psychologists, local social workers, local clinics are not doing evidence-based practices in suicide prevention. You want to make a difference, let's hold the treatment system accountable for doing the work they should already be doing. So this is one of my big issues. Back in the 50s, when cancer care was horrible, when the treatments that we did have maybe saved 1 in 100 lives, when you went to the doctor and you got diagnosed with cancer, you got an evidence-based practice. And then we got better evidence-based practices and better evidence-based practices, but we did this incrementally by being universally dedicated to giving the best care on the evidence we had at the time. That's not what's going on in suicide prevention at all. There was a New York Times story recently that sent me through the roof. A Olympic cyclist had a suicide attempt and was admitted to a hospital, and I want to say it was in New York City, was discharged to group therapy following her suicide attempt. Now, I'm not aware of any group therapy approaches being an evidence-based practice for suicide. And she was dead a couple of months later. And the article was about suicide prevention is failing. And it's like, oh, no, it isn't. The healthcare system is failing its customers, its clients, its patients, because we're not doing evidence-based practice. Imagine a woman was admitted with a cancer diagnosis at a New York hospital, and she was discharged to group therapy and not chemotherapy or surgery or radiation. We wouldn't be screaming about how horrible the suicide prevention network is. We'd be screaming at this hospital for not using evidence-based practices. How dare you discharge this woman without giving her evidence-based care? But that's happening every single day. So,
all right, let me push back on that just a second as well, because as you and I know, research, really high quality randomized control trials that are replicated take decades. And yes, we have a couple really, a few really awesome treatments that have that level of evidence base, and we need them. But you stifle innovation when that's the only thing that can happen. And so one of the things that I'm, excited about and promote are kind of innovative practices that surround themselves with all kinds of program evaluation from the gate, so that you're learning as you go and you're capturing data and iterating and moving. I think, if we, I think about the work that's happening at D.D. Hirsch with suicide attempt survivor, peer support groups, which is what many people in the lived experience community say was helpful for them in their recovery. They found peers who had gone through something similar. And so why don't we try that? But D.D. Hirsch in particular has said, okay, well, we don't know. And there is a potential that we could cause harm. So let's focus on our evaluation from the beginning. And they have a whole research team looking at that. And so I think part of it's like the established research, evidence-based best practices that we already know and have known for, upwards of a decade. And also, if you're going to try something new, have evaluation really built in strongly from the very beginning, so that you can course correct or even stop it altogether if it's showing that it's actually not working or even causing harm. But
so I think innovation,
go ahead.
I think you've got it backwards. I think that, in fact, it's much harder to get innovative practices implemented if you don't already have a system that's implementing evidence-based practices, right? So here's my point with innovation. So let's say you come up with something that shows that it's evidence-based and this works. If they're not implementing the existing research that works, why are they going to implement that? Right? So this is an argument that I have with people all the time, this idea that, we're going to have a new thing that everybody's going to implement. They're not implementing the things we already know that work. Why are they going to implement something new when they won't implement the things we already know that work? So the first step is you need to create a culture where, in fact, everybody agrees we need to universally implement best practices, right? That's the only way they're going to implement new practices that come along. There's this pipe dream that, I'm going to come up with this thing, and then everybody's going to implement it. Well, you know what? We've got collaborative safety planning that's evidence-based, not used universally, and it works really well. Crisis response planning, which may reduce suicide behavior by 50%, that's not being implemented universally. We've got non-demand caring follow-up services that's evidence-based with replication, and that's not being implemented universally. We've got CAMS, Collaborative Assessment Management of Suicidality, we've got dialectical behavior therapy, we've got suicide prevention, cognitive behavioral for suicide prevention, and brief cognitive therapy, all which have replicated impact. Those aren't being implemented. They were innovative when they were created, and nobody implemented them.
Yes.
So why do we think if we come up with something new? The only thing I see that would get implemented quickly if it was new would be some kind of a pill that was easy to distribute, that didn't have a whole lot of maintenance to it. That fits into the existing treatment paradigm, so that might get picked up pretty quickly. But you can invent whatever you invent, and it can have a great effect size, but nobody's going to implement it because nobody's implementing the things that have been around for 10 years. Why would something new be implemented over everything we already know about?
Okay, so to back up and cut through the clutter of the messaging, one of the main messages from everyday people needs to be hold your healthcare systems accountable. Are they implementing best practices? And that we should, as a general community, have a sense of what those best practices are and where to find them, et cetera.
Where to find them? Yeah, this is it. So if you're seeing a therapist, you should be asking them, what evidence-based practice are you using to treat suicide? Mm-hmm. If they say no harm contract, run out of the office and go see a different provider. If they don't know how to answer that question, and this is really key, this is the thing, and this is why I'm a big fan. Another message, we should be pushing for suicide to be a separate diagnosis, right? It should be its own diagnosis. And here is why. There's a lot of people that think diagnoses are stigmatizing, and that we need less of them. I disagree completely. It's the exact opposite. We actually need more diagnoses. When you look at, I'm not stigmatized by getting a sprained ankle diagnosis. It doesn't have anything to do with my whole personhood. There's thousands and thousands of medical diagnoses that we don't personalize. We need to get that point with these behavioral related diagnoses as well, that there's so many of them and that are really specific. Child-parent conflict should be a treatable diagnosis. Well, there's lots of child-parent conflicts that we should treat. Absolutely. We destigmatize by normalizing and being more specific in a diagnosis. This is really key. Another message point, and this is the treatment paradigm, and it sucks. People show up to see a therapist or they go up at the hospital and they've got suicide. But we don't treat the suicide. We diagnose an underlying mental condition. We'll give them a depression diagnosis or a bipolar diagnosis or borderline personality diagnosis or a substance use diagnosis. And then we treat the underlying condition that we think is causing the suicide. Two problems with that. One, mental illness doesn't cause suicide. Big bunch of crap. And I love Dr. Joyner, and he is one of my huge influencers, but his belief that suicide is 100% related to mental illness, bad, wrong, incorrect. Two, we know everything we do know about the research at this point shows that treating the underlying condition does not reduce suicidality. So if someone presents and they're depressed and suicidal, just treating the depression does not reduce the risk of suicide. And we allow this because there isn't a specific suicide diagnosis. Once you give and provide a specific suicide diagnosis, now they're going to be required to use an evidence-based practice to treat the suicidality. Currently, they can say, well, they're suicidal, but we think the depression's causing it, so we'll treat the depression. It doesn't work. But if I force the healthcare system to give suicide as a diagnosis, now look what we've done. Now they're forced to do a best practice for suicidality. And so what you see, a lot of people go to the hospital, they get diagnosed with depression. The most likely treatment they're going to get a short admit, and they're going to get discharged with antidepressants. What's the evidence suggest about SSRI treatment alone for suicide? It's not good. It may make it worse. It certainly doesn't make it better. We need to make sure that people are getting evidence-based care. So if you want to do a call-out culture, let's call out the healthcare system for not using evidence-based practices that we know work. Do they work as good as I'd like them to? No, they don't. I would love to have effect sizes that blew everybody's mind, and people come into treatment and they do a treatment and everybody's cured. I'd love it. But we didn't get that way with cancer overnight. In fact, the way that we improved our cancer care was providing the best care that we knew at the time, and then tweaking that and adding to it and layering it. You'll see a lot of cancer treatment is layered. That's what we did with HIV as well. It wasn't one treatment, another treatment. They started layering all the different treatments together. And when they started sandwiching everything, they found, boy, we put all these pieces together, we get really good effect sizes. Currently,
I'm going to pivot you just here as well, because I think we've got some really good suggestions on the content of the messaging. I want to also hear about your tactics of delivering the messaging, because I also think you bring tremendous amounts of gifts and insight here. I remember when I reached out to you probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and I said, Bart, how the heck do you have so many followers on Twitter? Do you remember what you said to me?
No, what did I say?
You said engagement. So tell me about engagement as a way to increase the effectiveness of the delivery of your messages. And also, I want you to, after you speak of that, to also speak about humor, because you're a funny man. Yeah. As much as you're like, rah, right now, you're freaking hilarious. Yeah. So what have you learned?
Yeah. So one of the things about engagement is that disagreement is a form of engagement. Don't shy away from disagreement. I don't need to convince everybody about this, but if you're willing to fight me with about this, that's engagement, right? In fact, one of the times I gained some of the most followers was when I was in arguments with people who are big gun rights supporters, and we were talking about gun safety and suicide. And one of the most interesting things about this is that they were, I think at one point threatening to shoot me, which I thought was kind of funny because they were touting responsible gun ownership, and I didn't think responsible gun owners threaten to shoot people in the head. But apparently the spectrum of responsibility shrinks or grows depending on where you're at in a Twitter argument. But one of the most interesting things in that fight was that I wasn't going to give up on them, and so we went round and round. And then one of the things that I discovered that was heart-wrenching was the people that were the angriest at me, Sally, eventually disclosed that they had lost loved ones to gun suicide. Mm. The people that were the angriest at me were in the most pain and the most impacted by gun-related suicide. So that was a really clear, the reason they were fighting with me was because it was important to them at many different levels. And I never got angry at them. I never was abusive towards them. I just kept reiterating my point. This is important. This is what I'm saying. We're disagreeing about this. And you're saying things I'm not saying, but I stayed engaged with them. I gained a ton of followers that day. And part of it, and I'll tell you who does this, Mike Anestis, Psych Brown Bag on Twitter, his ability to have really respectful, powerful conversations with people that don't agree with him is phenomenal. So one, with engagement, people who disagree with you and are vociferously disagreeing with you are your most engaged audience. They are engaged. You can't disagree without being engaged. Two, about engagement, always respond and give people something that they can take away. Even so, like sometimes I'm really busy and somebody have reached out to me on Twitter and it's like, I don't know if I have, but give, when people ask you for something, if you can give it to them or point them in the right direction, do that. Don't put, why don't you Google it? If somebody reached out to me recently and they're wanting to get involved with suicide prevention, this is really common. People who are survivors, either they've lost someone or they've survived their own attempt, they instantly want to be out presenting in front of everybody. I, as a general rule, don't think that's the greatest first step, by the way, right? I think there's lots of things that can lead to that. But rather than giving a big lecture, well, here's some ways for you to get involved. And I did a little bit of research for them and gave them some avenues that they could look into, right? So if people are reaching out to you, be as helpful as you possibly can, right? That's really, really important. If you want people to follow you, follow them back. I'm a big, particularly on Twitter, I'm not a fan of the folks that only want to be followed. If I want people to follow me, I should be willing to follow them and see what they have to say. So I think reciprocity and egalitarianism are really important engagement. I think that in terms of one of the things that's really important, I think this is really key. Everything that we've learned that's effective in suicide prevention suggests that when the people that are having thoughts of suicide feel respected and on equal footing with the people helping them, the more collaborative it is, the more effective it is. Yeah. And so and I don't know about you, Sally, but my original training in suicide intervention was the expert model. You're the expert. You're going to do these things. Yeah. And it turns out that that's not particularly effective. It does work sometimes. Look, anything can work sometimes, but collaboration works better. So finding ways to connect with people, finding common ground with people that you don't agree with, which can be really hard. And sometimes I do well at that, and sometimes I don't. But that's a really good engagement strategy. Also, I think it's really important to be really clear about this. The new form of conformity is that you go along with whatever the movement is and agree with what people say. I don't believe that's a good way for engagement. If you really want to get engagement and traction, you've got to be willing to think differently, and you've got to be willing to challenge the status quo, whatever that status quo happens to be. And so it's one of those things that I pride myself on being an equal opportunity offender. If I agree with you, and whether I like you or not, I will acknowledge that I agree with you, and you can be my best friend. But if you're saying something I don't agree with, we're going to have a discussion about it. Doesn't mean we're going to agree in the end, but I'm not going to go along with my lovely friends just because they're my friends. And there's lots of stuff that I see in suicide prevention, like that Tumblr, getting people posting pictures on Tumblr of non-suicidal self-injury, right? I thought that was atrocious. And there are many people that I adore and respect on the other side of that argument. Okay, I'm still going to adore and respect you, but I'm going to tell you, I think that's really bad news. I think censorship is always bad by and large.
Wow, thank you. All of that's really great. Talk just for a moment about humor, because I do see you using humor as a way to connect with people and also a way for us to kind of take care of ourselves. Do you think, is there space for humor in this field, in our work?
Yeah, I think there's got to be. And I think one of the reasons that, I saw this link, somebody did a Twitter analysis of people in suicide prevention and people with lived experience. And the overlap was almost like zero, right? So the people who were talking about suicide, actively talking about suicide on Twitter, were not in any way connected to all suicide prevention folks on Twitter, right? And I think that there's a couple of things. I think that we're stuffy, we're a little arrogant, and we take this, I think, too seriously without recognizing that humor is in fact you will talk to people at risk of suicide and they will laugh about themselves sometimes. They will laugh about what they're going through. They will find the situation funny. That doesn't mean they're not close to killing themselves. They may very well be. And the farther people get along in the suicidal mind, the less likely that is to occur. But people find themselves funny. They find suicide funny, right? So there was a huge debate about suicide memes. The youth are on Tumblr and on Reddit sharing suicide memes, and suicide prevention professionals come across these things and their immediate reaction is, this is so unsafe. Yeah, let's definitely shut down the teens making suicide memes, because that'll definitely tell them that we're really, really, really involved and want to understand them and connect with them and help them struggle with their battle. It sends completely the wrong message. So for me, humor is really important. Humor that is respectful. Mm-hmm. So, and I think one of the things, and there's two things about this that I think I do not share suicide memes that encourage people to engage in suicide behavior, right? I don't want them censored. I'm not a fan of censorship. I don't believe that's helpful. But suicide memes that get at the heart of the problem and the ambivalence and the struggle or the things that are keeping them safe, even those things are like that, you've probably seen the Make Mom Mad meme, right? So this person is facing overwhelming pain and misery, and they're close to suicide, but the one thing there is keeping them safe, so it'll make mom mad, right? You know what? If that gives that person some relief, and if that's that person's story that I'm concerned that my suicide behavior would harm my mom, if that keeps them alive, you know what? I'm 100% for it. Absolutely. There's a difference between guilting people, right, which I'm against. I'm totally against the whole approach. I think it's a really ineffective approach and harmful. Mm-hmm. But people acknowledging that they're concerned about hurting other people is what's keeping them alive, and they think that's funny, by all means, let's share that with them, right?
Because they're thinking it. Right? It's something they're thinking about. So when you say it out loud, it's shocking, but it's there. You know? It's
there. So we want a culture where people can talk openly and honestly about suicide and not have people immediately want to throw them in treatment or say you shouldn't share, that it's unsafe. where people can share where they're really at. And this is what's interesting. When we try to shut that thing down, all we do is they cut us out of it.
And they go underground.
They go underground. So we gain absolutely nothing by that. And I really learned by lurking on Reddit and Tumblr that, one, when you see people make these suicide posts, how little trolling there actually is. There is some trolling, but most people are incredibly supportive. And I felt that way too. This helped me today. I'm not alone. One of the things I think this is really hard for people who experience suicide because they can't talk about it. They don't realize they're not alone. There's a whole lot of us out there that have struggled with this or are struggling with this. And if you've ever been on Suicide Watch, people on Reddit, the Suicide Watch subreddit, where they actually have moderators that are anonymous that support people and stop trolling. People will report the most agonizing details about their life and about how close they are to killing themselves, and they're trying so hard. And somebody will chime in and say, I've been feeling that way, and you sharing that made me feel better and gave me hope. So we don't really understand all that well what people who are really fighting suicide, what helps them and hurts them. We have some ideas, but I guarantee you, telling people to not freely share what they're going through and being able to have other people see that and respond and connect with that is definitely something that people, they find that helpful, right?
That's right.
They do find that helpful. And that's why when people start talking about censorship's approach, I get really worked up because it's not good at all. It also sends a message that we're not strong enough to deal with these painful messages, right? Which is what happens with a lot of people when they're in therapy and they disclose their suicide risk. Their therapist freaks out. The number of friends I've had who told me about having to console their therapist after disclosing their suicide crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're a therapist and you are having a crisis because the person you're treating is in a suicide crisis, I don't have kind words for you.
Yeah, you need to get out of the business and go do something else.
I will be compassionate, but you need some support before you get back in the therapy room because a good chunk of our clients are dealing with suicide thoughts. They're just not telling us.
Right. Wow, Bart, so much here. Our time has passed. I can't believe it. I just looked at the clock. I'm like, oh my gosh, wow. So I'm just going to do a quick wrap up, a quick summary of some of the themes of our conversation. I'm going to come back to you for some final thoughts, some final takeaways, and then we'll close. So Bart Andrews, this has just been amazing. So we covered a lot of ground here. We talked about some of the tips on how to make your message cut through the clutter. And then we talked about your story, and actually the story of you coming out about your story is a really important story to share because it is a process and it's a push-pull and learn as you go kind of thing. I haven't heard the term yet before, safism, but I think there's, if there's not already. Safetyism. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. There's more that we need to talk about that as a field and kind of get that conversation going in a lot of places. You talked about the difference between lived expertise and lived experience, and that there's some overlap there, and there's some ways to move people, but not everybody with lived experience has lived expertise. We talked about the real important messages to get out there. Number one, that let's get upstream from the crisis of a suicide attempt and talk about, I always say, first thought. The first time the thought comes into mind, I just can't do this anymore. I just can't hang on anymore, and address and let people know that those thoughts are treatable. Let's stop it there before, like any other issue, it progresses into something catastrophic. Let's talk about holding our mental health and healthcare systems accountable to using evidence-based practices. Yes, we can go off and try some innovative things, but measure the heck out of them, and let's make sure we're doing the things we know that work first. Let's look at this issue of having suicide be its own diagnosis and the benefit of that, of having the specificity of the treatment focused on that, and that there is power in destigmatizing it when we're just calling it what it is, not some sub thing of another issue. We talked a lot about engagement, and that, disagreement, while for some people love it and relish it and debating, other people shy away from it because of our politeness culture. Disagreement is engagement, and that we can learn so much from each other by engaging in some of these. And I thought your insight about some of our most angry, most attacking people, that is actually an expression either of fear or pain a lot of times. And if we're patient and keep coming back with respectful conversation, we can often find common ground and kind of move each other forward, which is a big part of everything that we know that works, right? Collaborative, reciprocity, respect, empowerment, and dignity. When we can really focus in those parts of our engagement with one another, we will all grow. And then we closed a little bit by talking about the importance of humor, and that, yes, suicide is serious. Yes, it's life and death. And when we, the suicide prevention community, come at this with only seriousness, we actually drive a good chunk of our audience away. We are too serious. We're too smart for our own goods. We're too stuffy. And that humor, I have found, works really well to bring the walls down, to connect people on a really human level. When we laugh together, we actually, release hormones that help us relax into whatever we're doing. So thank you for all of that. So closing thoughts, Bart, anything that you want to make sure that our audience walks away with today?
So I think things that are most important is that we do know how to prevent suicide. We don't know how to do it perfectly. I'd love to have much better efforts, but you can get good care. Reaching out and getting help is a good thing, but it's really important that we have enough providers that are using evidence-based practices. I'd much rather people reach out and get help than not. You're not alone out there. It's important in suicide prevention work that we have fun. It is absolutely, I couldn't imagine being in a field and not being able to have fun with what you're doing. And I think that, hey, everybody, it's okay to have fun and do suicide prevention. In fact, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's one of the real gifts that we have, is that human beings in tremendous pain can also experience humor. In Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning, he talked about people in death camps would host comic plays and laugh.
That's right.
If people that are afraid that they're going to be sent off to be killed any minute can laugh at themselves and have fun, those of us in suicide prevention, I think we can afford to bring some humor and some levity in the work that we do. I think the people we work with would appreciate that, and it makes us more approachable. And also, I think it probably reduces burnout, to be honest.
Absolutely.
And I think the final message is, Sally, keep doing what you're doing. Doing podcasts like this is a really important part of getting the word out and giving people alternate views and alternate approaches, and letting people make decisions for themselves. Hey, this works for me, or it doesn't, or I'm going to fight back against that. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, Bart, as usual, my head is very full with all kinds of thoughts, and I love when you disagree with me, because I'm like, that's a really good point. Let me think about that. If people want to engage with you, where do they find you? What's the best way for people to reach you?
So on Twitter, @BartAndrews is one of the easiest ways to get a hold of me. So I'm there. I'm always checking it out. So that's a good place to reach me.
Great. Well, thank you, Bart, for joining me with your very precious time and your wisdom today. Thank you to all of our listeners tuning into this conversation. If you liked what you had heard today, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. It really, really helps us gain visibility through all the algorithms that get people connected to our content. If you want to hear more podcasts, you can go to iTunes. You can go to the website, sallyspencerthomas.com. You can sign up for the newsletter. We have Twitter chats and webinars and all the things. And I would really love to hear from you about what you want to hear more about and what you like and don't. So let's close. Our motto, open your heart, change your thinking, and take action to save lives. Together we can restore dignity and sustain a passion for living. Take care.